Okay, colleagues, I can see everybody starting to come into the session, so we will make a start promptly. Thank you very much for joining this parallel session this afternoon. As chairs of these sessions, we get randomly allocated to them, I think, but I'm really excited that I've been asked to chair this session on creative assessment for STEM, something really close to my heart, and the future for inclusive assessment and feedback processes. My colleagues very kindly switched off the PowerPoint, so I'm going to have to struggle to remember to pronounce. Thank you. I was going to struggle anyway, but I'm really pleased to introduce Louise Krompotek, who's going to present this next session. Thank you very much, Louise.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Oh, looks like we're at the very beginning of the presentation, so there we go. So yes, welcome, and thank you for joining today. I wanted to have a couple of sort of opening remarks before I jump into my presentation. And this session today and the conference as a whole really had me thinking about the future of higher education curricula. And two things that come to my mind are really, what are some of the trends that I've seen in education, and what is the lasting impact that the pandemic is going to have on the education system? Prior to the pandemic, courses were being moved online, but very slowly. Overall, when we think of the whole sort of scope of the courses, then all of a sudden, courses had to be moved online in a very short period of time. And for many institutions and educators, this meant taking their existing material and plans and basically making them, putting them online and making them available for online delivery. And I think in the last year, we've seen that perhaps isn't as effective as we would really like it to be. And so now we have this opportunity to really take a closer look at what we deliver and how. So today's session is really talking about sort of assessments in STEM disciplines. And the idea is sort of, what can we do with assessment? How should we assess students? Like, do we need to rethink that? And also, how can we support all learners, whether they're in person or remote? And I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of traditional assessments and then online assessments. I want to show some examples, and then we're going to go into some breakout rooms to have some discussions and to really sort of open the floor. And I want to hear from you in terms of what have you done and what sort of interesting aspects of assessment have you used in your courses, and what do you plan to continue to bring forward as we move sort of back into a more traditional style, maybe some in-person, some hybrid, different modalities, really is what I see happening after the pandemic. So when I think about traditional in-class assessments, right, they often include sort of this scaffolding of questions. We have these recall type questions, definitions, theorems at the very lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy. Just memorization, and can you repeat that to me? And then we have sort of process type questions, solve an equation, or, calculate something, where the student has been given a set of directions that they would normally follow. And then as we move up Bloom's taxonomy, we get into some application questions. Now, most assessments have a sort of separation of these things. And part of the process is, okay, we want to obviously, explore our students' knowledge and define, okay, so here are some of the weaker students, here are good students, here are maybe some brilliant students that can do whatever you throw at them, and be able to sort of identify where students fall in that range. One of the problems with traditional in-class assessments and midterm exams and final exams is that obviously students get the same questions. Now, in some courses, instructors will have 2 or 3 versions of an exam, and they will separate, they'll divide that out between the students. But part of the problem there is that then that increases the marking effort, especially if it's paper-based. The other issue that we often find with traditional sort of in-class assessments and handed-in assessments is that feedback is often delayed by a week or more. And this doesn't help students. My son, who is in engineering at the University of Waterloo, his last term, he was completely online, and he was working on his courses. And as he was working through his courses, there were a couple of his courses that he got absolutely no feedback on how he was doing, didn't receive his assignments back or his labs back until after the final exam. That does not help a student along their path of learning. They're not sure how they're doing. They're not sure if they've done what the instructor wanted. They're not sure if they explained things properly. And so all of that, the opportunity of learning as they go and learning, how to discuss things, how to explain things, how to write a proper solution for a problem, he missed out on a lot of that because he didn't get any feedback until it was too late. And so one of the things that's really important for students is getting that feedback in a timely manner so that they have the opportunity to digest that and then apply it as they continue on in their course. And this is where sort of online assessment really comes in. Because online assessments, and now here I've written in online classes, it doesn't have to be in online classes. Online assessments can be used no matter what modality you're actually teaching. So whether you're doing a traditional in-person class or a hybrid or high flex as one of the terms that is currently being used, or fully online, you can still use online assessments and get some of the benefits from them. And one of the benefits in terms of online is really the randomization that you can embed within the questions can help in a couple of different ways. It can reduce cheating, as I've listed here, because now students can't just share answers with each other. If they need to, or if they're looking to work with someone, they have to talk about the process. How did they get to the answer rather than just the final value? But the other thing that randomization allows is in a class, you have the ability to provide practice opportunities for your students. So as they're working through their material, they can actually try questions that they might see later on and have an opportunity to go through them multiple times. With online assessments, there's a lot of automatic grading that is available, which both reduces the workload, but it also allows educators to really focus on the questions that need your expertise to really, decide, how does the student understand this material? Do they get what I was trying to get across in my class? And of course, with online assessments, because those are automatically graded, you can get immediate feedback to your students. And this is very helpful, right? Both immediate and timely. And important, important feedback for your students so that they can see exactly how the solution is done. Now, of course, online assessments are not sort of the magic bullet, right? They won't do everything. And we have to think about how do we ask students questions? So things like recall type questions or process type questions. What we've seen in the last year is a lot of exams and assignments have switched from having many of these at all to, okay, well, if it's going to be open book, I'm not going to ask any definition type questions or any, what is the formula for calculating something? I'm not going to ask those questions because students have the book right beside them. So I'm just going to ask on these other questions. Here are some process questions or application questions. And then I think we have to think about, what does that mean for the overall assessment? So again, I'm going to refer to my son's experience simply because I was able to watch that firsthand from a student's point of view. And what happened with a lot of their courses was they did assessment very differently. So they did add a lot of these sort of more difficult questions, harder questions for students, which, in some cases, the students were left not being sure how to approach these problems. The other thing that I saw that happened was with a lot of the exams, the students were given one question at a time they had to answer that question and then move on to the next question. And like they had to hand in that question as they were done. And as I watched my son do this, I was thinking from my experience, that's a very different testing experience than what I had. When I was going through university, there were all these, this is how you take an exam, the sort of explanations. And so basically look at all of the questions and start with a question that so that you can kind of settle your nerves and then move on. And you can leave the questions that maybe you're not sure of or that you're not aware of, like leave those at the beginning and come back to them. But now if students are being given one question at a time, they don't have that. It's, you have to know what that particular question is at that exact moment. And I think that now what we need to do is we really need to kind of think about that a little bit. And how do we assess students? And what knowledge and understanding is important, and how do we get students to show that comprehension? So what I want to do today is really spend a little bit of time going through some examples, just some examples of different ways of asking questions, or some examples of putting in some interactives and having students interact with elements as opposed to just reading material and then answering a question. Some open-ended questions to get at some of that higher level knowledge, but still be automatically graded for instructors. And chained questions, the ability to have one question, how a student answers one question, be used when you're grading subsequent questions. And then the last one is really sort of adaptive questions and assignments, where you have the ability to help the student through a problem, and even if you're not there. And so I'm going to talk about these particular examples. I'm going to give some examples. And I'm going to do that inside of the Mobius platform. The Mobius platform is a courseware platform, and it can be used to deliver lessons, assignments. It can include videos, inline questions, interactives, but I'm just going to focus on the assessment piece because that's what this session is all about. So I'm going to sort of share my screen. And entire screen. So now hopefully everyone can see this. I'm going to jump into a particular class inside of Mobius. And as I said, I'm just going to kind of focus on some of these assessment pieces so that we can set up the stage to have some really good discussion, hopefully, towards the end of the session. So what I've done is I've actually set up a unit here called Creative Assessments that has a few different elements in it. So I'm going to walk through these, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we can think about when we're creating assessment inside of a system, an online system like Mobius. So if I start at this one, which is the alternative questions, here we have the ability with a system like Mobius to be able to incorporate both that randomization so that students can try and try again, the ability to provide feedback right away, and then also the ability to ask questions in different ways. So this one is a simple sort of equation of a line, right? And very simple mathematics. What is the y value of this line for each value of x? So they're given a value of x, they have to plug it in and then put in the answer. And if the student starts to notice, they'll hopefully start to see, okay, well, so each time I go up by 1 in x, I'm going up by 3 in x. So look at that. That's interesting. And start to get some understanding just through the experimentation. And now I have the ability to immediately see, well, how did I do on that? Oh, I got everything right. And I can then try another if I got some wrong, or if I just want to have some more practice. And now I have a different variation of that same question. So as a student in my learning process, if I'm not sure of something, then I have the ability to try and try and try again. You also have the ability to ask questions about lines in different ways. So here it was a table of values, fill in those values. You can ask a simple question like true or false. Does this line pass through this point? And the student has to select true or false. And again, they can click how did I do and immediately get that feedback of whether they got it right or wrong. And so here some feedback is provided, right? We can verify by comparing the left and right hand side. So the left hand side, y is going to be 9, and the right hand side is 2x plus 3, which is equal to 9. And so, oh, this one should have been true, so let me try another. And now I have the chance to try another one. But one of the benefits of using a system that is really designed for STEM is the ability to ask sort of more open-ended type questions. So this question, provide an equation of any line that passes through a point. So now we're not asking the student to use exactly what they have. So that we're not saying, give me the equation of the line that has this slope and through this point. Here we're saying any line. So now we're trying to see if the student understands what does that actually mean. And with a system like this, the student could type in x equals 5. That would be graded as correct. The student could type in y equals 10, which would also be graded as correct, or could type in something like y equals 2x. They could also type in something like y equals 3x minus 5. So the system can actually take the student's response and will make sure, one, that it's linear, but then also that this point satisfies that line. And again, the student has the ability to check their answer right away. Now, if we think about this in a different way, let's think about some science examples. So with some science examples, and I'm just waiting for this to load, you can do the same thing in terms of science. You have the ability to ask questions in different ways. And I'll just scroll down here. So here, for example, you can have the student watch a video, and then you can ask them a question. So this one can be, a text region that the student types in. You can actually, if you're worried that, maybe spelling is going to be an issue, you can actually provide them with a drop-down list. You can also grade using sort of keywords and wildcards and things like that. So you can actually allow for some grading, some spelling mistakes. And here, if I click on how did I do, you can see, I'm just going to show this one. Here you can actually specify the correct answer, and this has been done on purpose, that you will accept different spellings of the word, and you can actually specify that as you're grading. Here's just another example of, again, watching a video, but then asking the student a question. So now select a valve. And so here you can create hotspots. And so it's just a different way of asking the question that the student can do. And most of these questions, and the platform in general is accessible in terms of the students who have, perhaps visual issues or have fine motor control issues, can actually use their screen readers, can use keyboard navigation in order to get from one element to another. So there are lots of different ways of asking questions. And I think as we move things online, that's what we need to think about that. So maybe I don't ask, solve this equation for X. Maybe I ask it as, what value of X would do something, so that I'm asking it in a slightly different way. And now I want to show sort of a step-by-step type solution. So here, this is what is called in Mobius the adaptive question. And the adaptive question allows you to get the student to put in an answer. So here I'm going to put in a value, 32. And if my answer is correct, when I click on verify, I can just move on to the next question. But if my answer is incorrect, then I can actually provide steps for the student. And so now I can say, okay, well, what is the common difference? Is 3, and what is the first term? So the first term is 2. Okay, I got that right. So now what is the expression for the nth term? So I can walk the student through what are the steps in solving this problem. Again, this will be extremely helpful when the student is at home, working on a problem or working on a lesson, that they don't have the same support infrastructure that they have if they're sitting in class or if they're sitting with a group of friends working on a problem. And here, I'm just going to put in a value. And then my last one is, again, now that you have an expression for the nth term, what is the final value? So here I'm able to walk through, and you, as an instructor, you are able to specify, okay, well, if the student got this first part wrong, but they managed to get everything else right, then they can get part marks. And you can separate out the part marks that you decide to provide to a student depending on how they've done, how many parts they've answered correctly. You also have the ability to allow the student to take different number of attempts. So here, if we look at another example, this is more of a physics example, considering the box on the ramp. And here we have, given the coefficient of static friction is mu between the two surfaces, what is the largest angle of incline for which no slippage occurs? So now, again, you have the ability for the student to just work out the answer, put in the answer. If they get it right, then again, they could be done this question. But you can also provide them with a number of attempts. So now the student has the ability to try it. If they get it wrong, they can just check their values again. And then I'm just going to skip to the next part. If they still get it wrong, you can then give them, again, walk them through. So the first step in a problem like this is usually to figure out the free body diagram. So, here you can put down the direction. So here's the weight. We'll have, I'm just going to put some in here, normal, and then there's another force going here. And then I can just verify that. And here I got that correct. So now it's going to ask me the next step. So what are the equations of motion in the X direction, in the Y direction? And then finally, when you've answered that, you will then get asked, what is the final answer? So here, those ones I got wrong, but here it's provided the correct answer. So even though I didn't know how to put those together, I still got the value so that I can continue on with the problem. And now, if I think about this problem, if I'm a student and I can go to an instructor to ask questions, I can say, okay, well, I understood this free body diagram. I didn't understand how to get these equations of motion. So now my question to the instructor is not just, I couldn't get question 3. Now the questions that you can get from your students are more directed to where they had an issue. And that's, again, a very powerful thing that you can do. As people move to sort of the flipped classroom or some hybrid type classroom, a lot of instructors will have students reading material at home, doing some examples, and then when they come into class and they're in person together, they'll be working on problems. And so having the student being able to do some of this at home, but come to the problem solving session with specific questions makes it a much better engagement with the instructor and the student. So now I'm just going to submit this assignment, and then what I will do is I will move on to another example. So here I wanted to show a little bit about interactives, and I think there are lots of interactives that are out there for different disciplines. Here I've just pulled in a FET from the University of Colorado, and if we look at this one, you now have the ability with some of these interactive elements and learning objects that are available to pull those into a platform and then be able to get the student to follow some instructions and answer questions based on it. So here, for example, this particular one, the student, okay, so you're going to go into the lab. And now here's our lab. We're going to set the length to 1 and the mass to 1. So now the student is setting up the lab just like they would in class or in their lab. You can add a stopwatch. And then we want it to be Earth. So we've got that, and we've got the simulation. And now, first of all, you're asking the question to calculate the period of the pendulum, because you know that the length is 1 meter. That's been set. So the student can now answer that and put in their answer. But now here comes the lab piece. So you're going to displace this lab by a vertical position of 20 degrees. So all we do is we can click and drag and move this. And let me just scroll up so I can see that. So here you can see the angle showing. And then when I let that go, it actually starts to move. So if I click on play, I can then sort of time it between these two elements so that I can try to get a good reading of, okay, so this is how many seconds or how many milliseconds it takes for the pendulum to swing. And then I can go on to answer the other questions in terms of what is the period, compare the two periods, are they the same? And then I can make changes based on instructions that are given, and I can actually work through an example. So this, obviously, as the student is working with this, they're getting a better a sense. It's not the same as being in person in a lab and having the physical touch of things, but it does give the student at least some ability to interact with something and get some better understanding of the concepts that they're trying to learn. I'll also show an example here, which is a Taylor series. So in mathematics, often we talk about the Taylor series and looking at how do we use a Taylor series to approximate another function. So in this case, it's using the Taylor series to approximate the sine function. Here we have the sine function, and this is the order 1 approximation. And now as I change the order of approximation, you can see that the blue graph is changing. So the solid graph is changing. And you can see that as I extend the order of expansion, it gets closer and closer to sine. And really, that's what you want students to start to understand, is to get that knowledge that, okay, the order allows me to get closer and closer to the given function. And now, what are some of the things that I might want to think about? And we can ask questions. So here the expansion point is 0, which is where it is. What is the error of the order 1 approximation? So now we go back to the order 1 approximation, and we can see the approximate value and then what the error is. So now here I can put in the value for the error. So here I didn't do the calculation of the error. You could ask the student to do that, but in this case, they just had to read it from that element, and then they can click on how did I do. So these interactives, again, allow students a way to visualize things, to interact, and to be more a part of their learning. I have 2 more that I want to show. Here is a sort of a lab chain, a sample lab, and I have my values written down so that I can actually put in realistic numbers. So here, this is sort of approximately a student in a lab. Maybe they're told to gather 3 specific elements, or maybe they're sent a box with, here are 3 elements. So now what we want you to do is we want to measure it in grams and all of your samples. So the student goes ahead and does a measurement, which with their whatever tool they have available to them. Then they're putting this element in a water, and they're calculating how many milliliters does that take together, the 2 things together. So they're doing these calculations at home. Now here again, you may have to modify the lab that, what you're asking them to measure, what makes sense that they might be able to do at home and not in a lab environment, but you can at least give them some of the elements of the lab. So now they've put in these elements, they've measured the mass, they've measured the volume, they've measured the original volume of the water. And now you can go into the analysis part. So this first part, doesn't have to be graded. It can just be, okay, put in your values. And now here's the part which is the analysis, and this is the part that's going to be graded. And so now here we can, what is the volume of the sample by subtraction? So the student's going to subtract their values. And then they're going to do their calculation. What is the density? Based on using an equation that they've been given in their notes or in their textbook. Calculate the mean density and the standard deviation. So now the student is doing these calculations based off their measurements, and you can actually grade based off of their measurements, so that now it's not, you're not giving them the measurements and then just making sure they can do the calculations, but you're giving them more of the whole experience. And then you can give them part marks based on that. And now here's just another example. And this one, I'm not going to put in sort of realistic numbers. I'm just going to put in just some numbers so that I can get to the next part. So again, this is the same question, just asked in a different way, because that's part of what we want to talk about in this session is how do we provide questions in different ways, and what does that get the student to really talk about? So I'm going to click now on verify. And so again, here, this part here doesn't have to be graded, can just be the student has entered those values, and now they're asked to do that same calculation. And now there's a verify button so that you can actually have it all on one screen. And so similar to the previous one, the values are here. As the student works through the calculations, they will be available here as well. So this is just a very nice way of approaching a problem that, you know, you're getting the student to do some work that they would have done in a lab, but then you're also able to give them some automatic grading and some immediate feedback of what they have done and the calculation that they've done. And then you have the ability to ask some questions afterwards in terms of, you know, some analysis questions of where might the sources of error have been, and what else did they learn from this particular lab, and what would have helped them as they worked through the lab. And the last one that I wanted to talk about is really sort of open-ended questions. So again, this is the same question that I showed earlier in terms of an equation of any line that passes through a given point. But now I'm going to show you a couple of additional ones. So here, find a rational function with asymptotes at x equals -7, x equals 3, x equals 4, and y equals 0. So here you're now asking the student, you know, if you understand a rational function, you will understand that it's going to have an asymptote where the denominator is equal to 0. And it's going to have y equals 0 as an asymptote if the denominator is larger than the numerator, right? The order of the denominator is larger than the order of the numerator. So now the student can put in any expression as long as that is true. So what the system will do is it's going to look and say, okay, so is it a rational expression? Yes or no. If it is a rational expression, where are the asymptotes? And did they actually get asymptotes at these points? They could provide a function that has asymptotes at other points, but what we're testing here is, did they understand what it means to have an asymptote at these points? So here we can x -3 and x -4. So now the student can be graded based on what the student has entered. And similarly, here's another one, which is find a function that is increasing on a certain interval and decreasing on another interval. So here the student has to understand, okay, well, if it's increasing on an interval, what does that mean in terms of the first derivative? Or what does it mean, depending on what other question you might ask, what does it mean for the second derivative? And where are the points that you have to think about? And again, you're going to ask the student these questions and get them to really think and to really see what their understanding is. So I think using online tools really gives you the opportunity to ask questions in sort of a variety of ways, and to start to ask, let me just pull up there we are, to ask questions in a variety of ways, and to really think about how we want to ask students questions. So at this point, what I'd like to do is I'd like to sort of go into some breakout rooms. And there's a couple of questions that I would like to, people to talk about. And so the first one is, in your classes and when you've done different assessments, what type of assessments have you done? And what have you found has worked really well? And maybe what didn't work well? So sort of what have you used and what has worked and hasn't worked? And then we also want to kind of think about these questions. So as educators, do we need to rethink how we test for knowledge and understanding, right? And how does that potentially change in an online environment? Because now you have different elements that we're thinking about. And then the other thing that I often think about is, as we remove, or if we remove these recall type questions, what does that mean for the difficulty of an assessment? Does that make it more difficult? And if it does, do we need to do something to adjust for that? Do we need to think about that a little bit? And then finally, if we start to incorporate a lot of non-traditional questions, how can we make sure that we're scaffolding our assessments appropriately to be able to see the learning of our different students? So those are some of the questions, and I think we can probably, hopefully show these in the breakout rooms. I don't know. So at this point, I'll ask, okay, so I see that. Okay, so different types of online assessments. So at this point, I'd like to open it up and have a bit of a discussion with the team. I don't know if there's if we're going to go into a breakout room, or no. It looks like we have enough people that we could just do it internally here. So I'd like to open up the floor and hear from participants. What are some of the different types of assessments that you have used? So I think now people are able to.
Yeah, colleagues, you should all be able to speak if you just click on the blue microphone. So if you want to click on that and speak, that would be great, and we'll have a little bit of interaction. So you'll see the microphone link just below the video screens below where Louise is. Hi, go ahead, whoever's coming in. Who would like to speak?
I'm happy to go. If you can, is that picking me up?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, it's Jess. It's been really interesting. Thank you very much. I was a little bit brought me a little bit back to school, doing all that maths. Actually, glad. It was a refreshing to look at that. So I'm a lecturer in environmental science, and I teach very, very large class sizes. So being able to do something online, particularly with the way in which our university is looking at sort of sticking with a hybrid approach, would be really, really useful. I teach quite practical based things. So we have sort of like lab and PC skills as well. But I was just thinking in terms of like setting this up, and I know you were using, is it Mobius or something it was called? Is that like openly accessible, or does it work? In Reading we use something called like Blackboard, and I know it has ability to use tests and online tests and have online setups for marking and things like that. But the last time I used it, I mean, to be honest, it took me longer to set it up than it was to do the marking for 200 students. So yeah, I guess I'm opening it up to whether.
Yeah, so Mobius. Yeah, Mobius is a courseware platform. It can be integrated into the learning management system, and what we have found, over the years, is that the learning management systems are fantastic, but they're doing so much, right? Like it's a very wide type of functionality that they do, and so for STEM, it doesn't necessarily have all of the functionality that STEM instructors would really like to see. And Mobius will integrate into the I guess VLE, can integrate into that, whether it's Moodle, Blackboard, Brightspace, Canvas, can integrate into that. And then basically if students are in their classroom, they can click on a link that would then open up a Mobius assessment, and the grade would automatically be pushed back once the student is done.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, this is Melanie. I just had a question. We are at the Faculty of Dentistry, Oral Craniofacial Sciences. So I know we have basic sciences early on in year one, and bleeding into year two, we've got also anatomy, neuroanatomy. So can it be, I'm guessing it can be tailored to any discipline.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it can. And I think that's one of the things that I was interested in hearing from people is, what are some of the types of assessments that you have done that you would like to continue to do?
I think the biggest challenge we have is that currently we used to have a pool or a bank of questions that we would go to, obviously revisit, change, update, new versions. But with the online assessments, we've kind of lost that bank of questions, which is an opportunity for us to now redesign and rethink, and also put in new questions with which are more in line, most likely, with the new curriculum, where before we used to just go and pick out questions to embed into MCQs or SAB, single best answer SBAs. Sorry. So I think we're kind of at a point where we're open to using new alternatives, and also probably accepting that we have to sit this summer and write some new questions as well.
Yeah, definitely. As you start to look at sort of your online question and questions that you might want to use, there definitely is that upfront work of, okay, what is it that we want to ask, and how do we want to ask it? And then using a platform similar to Mobius, like, you have the ability, again, to still have your groups of questions, and you can then select from that group of questions and modify it as you go on. But then you have your bank again.
Okay. And can you use, I think I might have missed it. You can, I guess, and so the challenge we have is that we've got Moodle, where we do formative assessments, and where we can add a lot of features in terms of link it to learning outcomes, put in links to actual course material. And then we've got Max Exam, which doesn't allow us to do that. And our summatives are on Max Exam, our formatives are on the Moodle platform. So I think what we would like to do is obviously do our summatives the way we do our formatives, but we can't. So with Mobius, I'm guessing you can use it either.
Yeah, you have the ability to incorporate sort of lesson material that the student can then refer back to. You can put in metadata for questions so that it's there. And then you have the ability to link it into Moodle.
Okay, thank you.
So I showed a bunch of different assessment types in the in the examples. Are there some there that people here have used?
Not in our case, and I'm more involved with we'll say professionalism, ethics, and those type of. It's more situational judgment kind of questions where you ask you make up scenarios and you ask students to decide on the best course of action. I don't believe that was so.
All right. And does anyone else have any sort of types of questions that they might have used in the past that either worked really well or didn't work well?
Yeah, not from me. Just general online tests, as I said, that usually require me to mark them afterwards. So definitely interested in, particularly, I think the thing where you had like the different spellings, because often when people are typing, they're typing things incorrectly, and it's fine if you're reading it as a person, but I can imagine it'd be quite frustrating if your machine isn't picking up different spellings. So that would be something that I would look at implementing over the next year.
Mm-hmm.
I think it can depend. I've used a sort of online testing for different things, and really it depends on the student group has been the thing that I found the limiting factor, not necessarily the type of assessment, but whether the students want to engage with it or not. I think is probably more whether the cohort kind of makeup has been more important for my groups, really.
And have you found that like even during the pandemic, or has it gotten worse like during everybody working from home?
Well, I haven't been a lecturer for a little bit, but my students were all agriculture students. So if I let them, if they were working at home, they would be on a tractor or milking cows or something like that. The idea, I dread to think what has happened when the idea of sort of online learning has happened for those students, because that they just were not motivated to do. It just was. That wasn't why they were doing qualifications. That isn't the way they learnt or wanted to be. So, but something like the system that you showed us, where it was more interactive and it was step by step, I think they probably would have been more engaged in that than anything else.
And so then my next question, like to the group, is really what do you see as moving forward into the future? Do we need to rethink how we are assessing students? Like as we move forward, and there are going to be some online things, and how do we determine whether a student has the comprehension that we want?
I think one of the challenges we found is that we have to redesign the questions for online, because obviously we do not have as much, we'll say, control on what they can and cannot access. And you can argue that's irrelevant. If they're looking for the information, they are also learning in some ways. But in terms of the questions have to be written so that they are actually require them to I guess think more. So I used to have quite a few questions that were really factual, numbers, facts, percentages, especially for guidance in terms of, for instance, for us, it's guidance on units of alcohol, guidance on units of in terms of diet, how much sugar intake. So we have to design the questions differently because they can access that very quickly, and we cannot tell if it's something they know or they looked for. But I think if it's a question that asks them more to analyze something, to actually look at the applications of something, it's going to require them to do the thinking and less depend on searching for the answer, I guess. I don't know.
I think what I would like to see is this kind of assessment being pushed into either like a competency-based block of assessment where students can just go, right, okay, they get as many chances as they like until they've sort of demonstrated competency in being able to do these calculations. And all of that kind of moved into an online automated space that students have to kind of pass, but the time of the academic, if you like, and the real assessment tasks are much more kind of creative and much more engaging and problem solving. So yes, you need that kind of foundation level knowledge before you can move on, but let's kind of push all of that into it. Yeah, you can just, like your driving test, you can do that as many times as you like, but you need to be able to get there in the end. But we actually kind of want to build on that. And then I think the students will see that I'm not just gaining this knowledge just for the sake of it and getting a grade, but I actually need this knowledge to solve this very real problem that I'm being asked to solve.
Yeah, and so do you see then, Kay, sort of doing that separation of here are sort of competency marks per se for your course, and then here are different assessment marks, or do you see it as part of their overall grade for the course?
Yeah, I kind of think, and it'll depend on the discipline and how much goes into these. But I would actually like to say, right, okay, a third of your marks are in this section here on terms of this competency thing, or it's just, you just need to pass it, or that means you need to get 80% of this right. And then your grade will be based on that kind of more creative stuff. That kind of figure, I think, is up to a course team or whatever to think about, whether it's 80%, you've got to get 80%, 100%, whatever. But that's just a competency thing. You need it, you tick that box and that's yes, and then you move on. I have seen other models where, you actually get the actual mark. So if you've got 70% right or 80% right, 90% right, that would be, that would make up, say, 25 or 30% of your overall grade, and then the rest of it would be this kind of much more problem-based learning approach. So, and I think it kind of also speaks to Ruth's point that people that want a very practical, very vocational based education, they want to be able to do stuff. So it's, yes, you need to be able to calculate whatever it would be in agriculture, yield per hectare, or how much nutrient they need to put onto a field. So they need to be able to do the math and the kind of analyses that you've been talking about. But yes, I've got that skill now. And now actually I'm going to have, my problem is, how do I fertilize this field for the least amount of money or the least amount of, inputs, or the most sustainable way? So it's a much more interesting challenge, but they can kind of see that direct application of the math rather than it kind of, oh God, we've got to do all this calculation stuff in a science discipline, and I don't see where it's going,
Yeah, and I think the idea of authentic assessment, right? Having that assessment that directly applies to what they are doing, that they can see the use of it, is extremely important. And I think it is something that we can now get to maybe even a little quicker than we might have done in sort of a traditional setup of a class.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I think that almost in some ways it's counterintuitive, but by not making it like, part of the assessment, which might come at the end of the course, you're actually going, right, okay, the sooner you get to know this, the sooner you'll be able to do the more interesting stuff, and it just actually kind of, I suppose, puts the focus on what we're actually, in higher education for. It's not really about kind of awarding grades. It should be about, developing learning. But that's probably a bit too of a bigger question for this stage of the workshop.
Does anybody else have any thoughts in terms of, how should we start to think about our courses and how the courses are set up and designed?
I think certainly moving forward, assessments, the way we assess does need to be, reconsidered. I think that obviously we've had to do it quite quickly, but we use a lot of online assessments, so we use a lot for formative assessments. So, and the students seem to really enjoy it. I can vouch for, yes, it does take a while to set it up, but we've used like the drop-down boxes and, MCQs and things. But I wonder how, we're still very much so when we've set up quizzes and things, online, or when we've done our actual assessments online, we've used short answers or essay questions just to try and explore, and find out whether they've got that deeper learning, whether our students have got that deeper learning. But, I wonder about being able to use these ones. So our MCQs, how can they be used maybe a bit better just to find out that deeper level of understanding as well, because they'd be absolutely far better on us in terms of marking and the students as well. But it's just being able to use those types of assessments in maybe a smarter way. But yeah, I haven't discovered that, so any help would be brilliant.
One of the things that one of my son's calculus class did was, instead of it just being a straight MCQ, what they did was they did a multiple selection, and the question was, which of these have this characteristic? And so then all of a sudden you're not just telling, like, they don't pick just one. They had to look at each function to determine, did it actually match what they were being asked? And a couple of them were quite a bit, there was a little bit of a trick to them. And that was an interesting approach that I thought, okay, so they're still asking the question, but they're able to, based on which answers the student selected, they could get a sense of sort of how much did the student understand?
Mm-hmm. That's good, because I do often wonder, that they're having to recall that information, but actually they're seeing the information in front of them. They're seeing the right answer, which is obviously how I reassure my students when they're worried about their assessments. But, is it testing them that much where they're actually having to see that answer there? I just don't know.
Mm-hmm. And does anyone else have any thoughts in terms of how do we, going forward, how might we change our view on assessment and testing students' learning?
Okay, last chance for comments, because we'll be wrapping this session up shortly.
Can I ask more of a question than a idea about assessment, because they're teaching schools? Sure. Assessment kind of taken out of our hands a little bit. But have you got any scenarios where people have used Mobius kind of within class with kind of groups working together to solve a problem? Because we get some students coming who are kind of really hot on their maths and really good at it, others who don't. And I like the stepped way you could work through a problem and kind of peer-to-peer teaching that way.
So one of our schools, what they did was they've actually created, using that adaptive question infrastructure where you could verify things. They actually used that and created basically escape rooms. And so it was a series of 5 or 6 questions that a group of students would work on, and they were pretty challenging questions, but the group of students would work on it, and they had to work together to come up with the answer to then move to the next question. And they had to, the idea was to get through all of the questions to figure out, where they needed to go or something. But it was really set up as an escape room. And I actually should have included that in the examples that I did, because it was a very interesting use case. And from when they talked to the students afterward, like, the students really enjoyed the opportunity to work together on a more complex problem, but still be able to move through.
That's really nice, because I think it's touching on some of the transferable skills as well. And we've certainly used escape room formats in clinical skills, but I like the idea of applying it more in public health that I teach. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I think that probably is close to the end for today. So thank you everyone for joining, and hopefully you got some interesting information out of this session and some ideas in terms of what you might want to do to add some different types of assessment into your courses.
Thank you very much, Louise. That was really useful and interesting session. And thank you also, colleagues, for your active engagement in that. It's time for another sort of break, really, in the formal live program. Opportunity to watch any of the on-demand sessions. I know I'm getting a huge backlog of on-demand sessions. I think that's what my summer holidays are going to be used to sort of catch up, because there's a lot of interesting content. Of course, the Topia World's also open. If you haven't had a chance to look around there, that looks great fun. I've had a quick mosey round myself. I'm really looking forward to trying to catch up with some different colleagues in there. So please give that a go. The next formal live presentation is at 4 o'clock. And we've got a really exciting panel discussion. The 2 panel discussions I've been to so far in the conference have been really powerful. And the one we've got now promises to be equally so, looking at sustainable and innovative approaches to enhance employability and enterprise in the curriculum, looking at the challenges and the solution. So, colleagues, I really encourage you to join that at 4 o'clock. We've got some great speakers on that session. So I will now be quiet and leave you all to get a coffee and a break or stretch your legs, and hopefully see you in that next panel session. Thank you all very much.